5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
To be a Catholic, to be a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ, means to be an intellectual. But that doesn't mean that you have to run out and buy a tweed jacket and a smoking pipe. It doesn't even mean that you have to know how to read. So what does it mean to be an intellectual in the context of the life of missionary discipleship? That's what we're going to be talking about today on Ignition. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Bergwald, and we want to set your faith ablaze so that you might live the adventure that comes from a relationship with Jesus Christ. Before we get into today's topic, we want you to know that we love listener feedback. So if you've got questions about today's episode, or if you have ideas for future episodes, please contact us. The easiest way to do so is by email, and the address is ignition@sfcatholic.org. Again, ignition@sfcatholic.org. We're doing one of our occasional solo episodes here today where there's not a co-host across the table from me, but I do have my trusty sidekick, Casey. There's the alliteration, trusty sidekick, Casey. Casey Bassett, who works in the communications department, who's controlling all the lights and sounds and everything so you can hear, maybe see me as well. Casey, are you mic'd up today?
Yes.
Casey, what does it mean to be an intellectual? What would you have said before my open?
I would have probably said the opposite. I would have said somebody who spends time reading books, who spends time studying topics, and probably an intellectual is somebody who, in my mind, studies philosophy, like the higher things, theology, philosophy, not necessarily like the practical welding or something. But I suppose you could be an intellectual welder. I don't know.
Quite possibly. So what do you think? Where do you think I'm going with that open? That you don't even have. You could be illiterate and still be an intellectual.
My guess would be that experience of things, experiencing something is just as good or not better than reading about it. So if you're talking about like theology, then the experience of God in prayer is actually a form of intellectualism too, as opposed to reading books on theology.
Casey, sometime we're going to have to get you across the table from me and not just behind the scenes, because that's very good and very much along the general lines of where we're going today. So I do, there are a couple things that I'm after in this episode in light of that open and what Casey just shared. On the one hand, I think there's there's a popular understanding of the intellectual. I mentioned the tweed jacket, the pipe, and to Casey's point, a philosopher who's sitting around smoking said pipe and ruminating upon things.
It sounds awesome, by the way.
Right. Some of us, that sounds great. But some of you are like, I have no interest in that. But I still would submit, and this is not just my opinion either, that we as Catholics are called to the intellectual life. St. Paul says, Romans 12:2, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So there is something intellectual that needs to happen, that does happen as we grow in discipleship. As we grow in relationship with God, there is an intellectual component to that. But it's not exclusively intellectual. So I think that's part of the misconception. So I do think there's a popular conception of intellectual, which is related to, but not exactly the same thing that I'm going to be talking about today in terms of what it means to be a Catholic intellectual or an intellectual disciple or a missionary disciple as intellectual. There's a bit of an Venn diagram. They overlap the popular conception of what it means to be intellectual and sort of the broad Catholic take on that. They can overlap, but they're not synonymous. That's one thing. But I do think it's essential for us to grow as Catholic intellectuals in the broad sense of the term. So I got a few people who are going to help us out today. They're not in studio with us. In their person, they are not in studio, but their ideas are in studio in the form of books and articles. And one of them is very much an intellectual in the popular sense of the term. Father Thomas Joseph White. Casey, have you ever heard of Father White? Oh, you would love him. So this is a book, The Light of Christ, An Introduction to Catholicism. Father Thomas Joseph White, OP. So he's in the order of preachers. He's a Dominican friar and priest, Father White. He was a convert to Catholicism in early adulthood. He was I was telling somebody about Father White recently. He's an atheistic Jew. Now, some people are like, well, what does that mean? Well, I mean, by culture, by race, he was Jewish, but he didn't believe in God. So he by philosophical disposition, in a religious sense, he was an atheist, but culturally, in terms of race, he was and is Jewish. He had a conversion. Obviously, he's now Father Thomas Joseph White, member of the Order of Preachers, the Dominicans. And he's a brilliant man who writes beautifully about our faith, and very much with a strong intellectual approach. I just want to use the beginning of this book, The Light of Christ, to sort of as an entryway into the sense of intellectual that I want to talk about in this episode. This is from the introduction to his book. The introduction is called The Catholic Intellectual Life. And Father White writes, intellectus, so the Latin word intellectus, intellect. Intellectus means to read from within. To read from within. To be intellectual, to be an intellectual, means to seek to see into the depths of reality. To be an intellectual means to seek to see into the depths of things, to look deeply upon reality, upon everything. This is something we should all want to do and be. In fact, to a great degree, we do not have much of a choice. Human beings are made with the capacity to read from within. We tend inevitably to seek the truth about what makes things the way they are. Why is the natural world so beautiful? Why is it marked by an intelligible order that the sciences discover progressively? Are the forces that gave rise to the universe entirely impersonal and ultimately indifferent to human life? Why is there a world at all? If everything around us has a cause, does that mean there is a cause of all things? So these are all questions that we might raise in our own minds or in conversation with others. He goes on, not everyone ponders metaphysical questions. In fact, they are very likely of pressing concern for only a few people, so philosophers. Far more wonder about moral goodness. Nearly everyone is concerned to discern how he should live. This is not so much a concern about moral rules, though they are important. It is an attempt to penetrate the depths of our own existence. Again, intellectus, to read from within. Is this the right person to marry? Should I marry? Is this the subject to major in, or right job to take? Have I devoted myself to what really matters? We want to see ourselves from within, as it were, taking hold of the final meaning or purpose of our lives. And he goes on from there, and we'll continue with some of this, but I just want to stop or pause there. Again, to be an intellectual means to read from within, to see into the depths of things, to see into the depths of reality. Now, reading can help with that. If we're reading philosophy, if we're reading metaphysics, if we're reading theology, those books can help us understand reality in depth. They can help us read reality from within. But again, you don't need to read philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, dense theology in order to do that. In the sense that Father White is talking about here, Mary is perhaps the greatest intellect, the greatest intellectual, because she, more than any other human person, because her son wasn't a human person, Casey. He had human nature, but he wasn't a human person. More than any other human person, and together with her son, more than any other human being, read reality in depth, quote unquote read. She understood the depths of things. Remember, Casey, do you remember after Jesus was born, the shepherds come and they leave. And what does Luke tell us Mary did about these things that she just experienced?
I think he said she wondered about them.
She wondered, or another translation, pondered. She pondered. One way to describe the activity of being an intellectual in the sense that I'm talking about, that Father White and others are talking about, is to prayerfully ponder things, to consider things, to reflect on things. Now, this very much goes against the grain of our culture. This very much goes against the way that we just tend to live. And even if you're watching the gesture, as I'm rocking in my chair faster and faster and moving my hand in a circle faster and faster, our culture is all about go, 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 go. We live in a very impatient culture. I'm genetically predisposed to impatience. That's not an excuse. It's just, unfortunately, one of my dispositions. I want to do everything quickly. I've talked about that before on Ignition and other places as well. I want to do everything quickly. But that's not what it means to read from within. If I want to see into the depths of reality, which again, as Father White says, we all desire to do. You might never put it that way. That might be far more philosophically expressed than you ever would. But that's what we all desire to do. Maybe we don't wax metaphysically. Maybe we don't stroke our chin and ponder existential questions. But subconsciously, every one of us desire, at some level, to see into the depths of reality, to read from within, to be, in that sense, an intellectual. But if I'm just always going, that's impossible. You can't run a 50-yard dash and ponder at the same time. I defy anybody. The email address is ignition@sfcath.org. If you can run a 50-yard dash and ponder at the same time, email me and say, yes, Dr. Bergwald, I just did that. Those are activities that are incommensurable. They just don't go, they're like water and oil. They do not mix together. And there are times when we have to, quote unquote, run the 50-yard dash. Part of our life requires that we do things, some things quickly. But as human beings who desire to see into the depths of reality, who are made by our God to see into the depths of reality, to read from within, we need to create space in our lives to ponder. We need to create space in our lives to prayerfully consider the things around us. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're reading books. Going for a leisurely walk, even a hike, and pondering, considering the world around you, the beauty of nature that you're beholding, that's being an intellectual. Bird watching through your binoculars, that's being an intellectual. Cooking something scrumptious in your kitchen. I don't mean your microwave. I mean on the stove or in the oven. There's a way in which you can consider that being an intellectual. And that's what all of us, not just as disciples, not just as Catholics, not as Christians, just as human beings, this is what we're made for. Another alliterative phrase, consume content contemplatively. Consume content contemplatively. So consuming content, what do I mean by that? I mean, whether you're watching something or listening to something or reading something, do so with a contemplative spirit, which will allow you to ponder. If I were to stop and think about what are my favorite books, I think the vast majority of books that I would describe as my favorite books are books that I have to, on a regular basis, put down. Because they're so rich that I need to think about what I just read. And again, I'm using books as an example, but it can be any sort of the best content is content that requires contemplation, considering, prayerful pondering. But we have to create the space to do that. So that's where I want to turn to another intellectual in a certain sense, a similar sense to Father Thomas Joseph White, and that is the retired Archbishop Emeritus of Philadelphia, Archbishop Charles Chaput. In an address that he gave from 2017, so about 7 years ago now, called "What's Next? Catholics, America, and a World Made New," because he talks about the same sorts of things that we're talking about here. So if you're just tuning in, welcome to Ignition. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Bergwald, talking today about the need for us as disciples of Jesus Christ to be intellectuals, but not intellectuals in maybe sort of the standard everyday sense of the term, those who consider philosophical concepts and are reading in their mahogany studies, wearing their tweed jackets and smoking their pipes. Intellectual in a broader sense of really considering things in depth, in the sense of the word, its etymology, intellectus, who are interested in reading from within, to seeing into the depths of reality. So we're all called to be following the example of the great disciple of Jesus Christ, the greatest disciple of Jesus Christ, his mother Mary, who pondered all the things, pondered in her heart the things that she saw and heard after her son was born, and as we read in the beginning of Luke's gospel. So I want to turn now to this address from Archbishop Charles Chaput, where he speaks about sort of the current state of affairs, culturally speaking, in our country, and about what to do about it. So he sort of paints the picture of reality, and he says, so what do we do about our situation? How do we live the gospel faithfully in such a different, new culture? He goes on, it's part of our American DNA to want a well-crafted strategic plan to get the church back in the influence game. But cultures aren't corporations or math problems. They're living organisms. There's no quick fix for problems we behaved ourselves into, and the culture we have is a culture we helped make with our appetites, distractions, and compromises. So a culture is a living organization, not a math problem, not a corporation. There's no quick fix, he says. There's no quick fix for problems we behaved ourselves into. Cultures are the fruit of practices, of behaviors. And you can't just undo something that you behaved yourself into. The culture we have is a culture we helped make with our appetites, so that's our desires, our appetites, our desires, our distractions, and our compromises. The only way to create new life in a culture is to live our lives joyfully and fruitfully, as individuals ruled by convictions greater than ourselves and shared with people we know and love. It's a path that's very simple and very hard at the same time, but it's the only way to make a revolution that matters. So here he's going to get into, okay, so what do we do? Brothers, what must we do? To quote the Jews who heard Peter's sermon on Pentecost and were cut to the heart. Brothers, what must we do? So a little bit later on in this address, he goes on. So here today, what can we start to do? He goes on. He begins this way, or he continues this way. Hell has been described in a lot of ways, from a soulless bureaucracy to a furnace of fire to a lake of ice. But I think C.S. Lewis put it best in one of his novels when he says that hell is. Any idea, Casey, how C.S. Lewis fills in that blank? Hell is.
I don't have an idea on that.
Noise.
I did not know that. That's
noise.
interesting.
Hell is noise. If that's true, Archbishop Chaput goes on, and I think it is, then much of the modern life we share, we also make hellish by filling it with discord, confusion, and noise. Every day, every one of our choices is a brick in the structure of the heaven or hell we're building for ourselves in the next life. And we'll never understand that unless we turn off the noise that cocoons us in consumer anxieties and appetites. So And we'll never understand that unless we turn off the noise that cocoons us in consumer anxieties and appetites. Again, appetites there, desires. Silence is water in the desert of modern desire. I love that sentence. Silence is water in the desert of modern desire. God spoke to Elijah, not in the majesty of a storm, but in a small voice heard only in silence. When Cardinal Robert Sarah writes about the power of silence, he reminds us that God renews the world by first renewing each precious, immortal, individual person in the quiet of his or her soul. God is not absent from the world. We just make it impossible to hear him. God is not absent from the world. God, where are you? Where are you, Lord? He's not absent from the world. We just make it impossible to hear him. So the first task of the Christian life today is to unplug, carve out the silence that allows us to listen for God's voice, and make room for the conversation we call prayer. Again, to be an intellectual in this broad, deep Catholic sense is to prayerfully ponder things, to seek to see reality in depth. So he goes on now, prayer. If we don't pray, we can't know and love God. C.S. Lewis reminds us that we're embodied spirits. Our bodies are part of our prayer. We can and should pray anytime and everywhere. But kneeling down in worship at some point in the day acknowledges that the God of Israel is the God who made the stars without number. It helps us remember God's words to Job. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Our humility in prayer is an act of justice. Fear of the Lord, the respect and worship due our Creator, is the beginning of wisdom. And wisdom, as I said earlier, is the framework of a fully human life. That is an excellent point. Another point from earlier in this address. Wisdom, not just knowledge, not just facts. Wisdom is the framework of a fully human life. So we need to create silence. We need to pray. And now this is the next thing he says. It seems like, well, doesn't that go against what you said earlier, Dr. Bergwald? It doesn't. But I want to read and explain. And we need to, and then this next line he italicized, so he emphasized in his address, we need to read, above all, the Word of God, but also history and biographies and great novels. If we don't read, says Archbishop Emeritus Charles Chaput, we condemn ourselves to chronic stupidity and a conditioning by mass media that have no sympathy for the things we believe. Television is not a channel for serious thought. It is often just the opposite. And the internet, for all its advantages, is too often a source of isolation. So, this is why I wanted to read this excerpt from Archbishop Charles Chaput. And this is why I want to see how it integrates with what I've been saying from the get-go, that we're called to be intellectual. That doesn't necessarily mean to read. You can be an intellectual even if you're illiterate. But if you're literate, if you are literate, so some people are able to read, but it's really hard. Dyslexia, other sorts of reading disorders or challenges, things that make it hard. I'm not talking about those. People who have those challenges, difficulties, again, those who are simply illiterate, can still live the intellectual life. But for those who are able to, with relative ease, read, exercise the power of reading, Archbishop Chaput says we should. Because reading fosters a certain habit of mind which inclines us to the intellectual life. So I came across this book, this address rather, because of another book by Dr. Edward Shree, titled Into His Likeness, Be Transformed as a Disciple of Christ. So Dr. Shree, a great teacher of the faith, able to communicate ideas in ways that are very easy to understand. He cites this address and those words by Archbishop Chaput in his book, and my takeaway from that was this. Okay, so we can consume content in all sorts of ways as faithful Catholics. I can listen to podcasts. I can watch videos. But there is something about reading. There is a certain disposition of mind that reading uniquely fosters. And I think that the way that I name that disposition is prayerful pondering and contemplative consumption of content. I listen to podcasts. I'll watch some things on video. But what I have found is that reading uniquely, and again, reading is something that I'm easily able to do. But I think that's true, not of all, but I think most of those of you who are listening to or watching me in this episode of Ignition. So I want to challenge you. If you're able to read, do more of it. And as we're not just talking about philosophy and theology. As Archbishop Chaput says, this can be history, above all the Word of God, the Bible, philosophy, theology, but history, great novels, biographies of great men and women. Read more, watch less, and listen less. Why? Because doing so uniquely allows us to read from within, to see into the depths of reality. And to draw this full circle, what does that matter to the life of discipleship? Because what is at the heart of reality? Or better, who is at the heart of reality? God himself. Whether we read or not, when we ponder the world around us, the beauty of nature, the people that we're with, the words that we read, when we prayerfully ponder, when we consume that content contemplatively, we're put in deeper touch, deeper relationship with the Lord himself. And the more we do that, the more we come to know him, the more we can love him. And the more we see his presence around us, and in so doing, we can point him out to others, which is at the heart of missionary discipleship. And that wraps up this episode. Again, you can email us, ignition@sfcatholic.org, with any questions about today's episode or ideas for future ones. Until next time, may God bless you and read more.